Welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we'll be continuing our discussion of intelligence research, but what we'll be doing in particular that makes it different from the previous lecture is focusing in on the link between lifespan development topics that we've been covering throughout the class and this area of intelligence. How do we link these two together? Well, there's a couple different areas that we can pursue when talking about the link between lifespan development and intelligence. The first area where we can see a strong link between development and intelligence is how our skills and the intelligence test that we take can actually alter as we progress through different points in our life. Essentially, we can talk about how the tests have to be more difficult or less difficult as we progress to different points in our mental development. Another area that we can look at with respect to how developmental psychology links up with intelligence research is in the form of extremes of intelligence. And this can let us talk a little bit more about the concept that we discussed a little bit in our last class, this idea of heritability, how heritable intelligence is. But for this particular lecture, we're going to be kind of looking at nuanced discussions on the heritability of intelligence across different types and across different points in our life. Nuanced connections between developmental phases and growth in different performance ideas linked to intelligence. We want to reiterate that there's lots of different ways that developmental psychologists and intelligence researchers can define intelligence. If we go back to the theorist that we watched a video on in the previous lecture, Howard Gardner, I get a sense that essentially skills related to intelligence can be linked to maybe an overarching level of intelligence, but there's also these different facets of intelligence that are sort of unique to the person. And if we want to talk about cognitive growth, we do want to talk about the individual nature of different things that might pop up at different points in people's lives that don't necessarily fit the textbook definition of intelligence, but do relate to different intellectual capabilities and individual differences. This is also something that's reflected in some of the general intelligence tests that we talked about in our previous lecture. In essence, even though we tend to talk about an overall intelligence in the Stanford-Binet tests and the Wechsler scales, both of these tests do have subcategories within them that can focus in on specific cognitive skills. If we're looking at making tests easier or more difficult, we don't usually talk when talking about these tests about kind of finding ways to make everything more difficult. We can narrow in on specific aspects of these tests that need to be made more or less challenging at different points in our life. Or in essence, we can say that performances should be better or worse at different points in our life on these tests within these subcategories. There's other types of intelligence, though, that we've only briefly alluded to thus far. One of the ones that I sort of mentioned, but we didn't really tackle in depth, is this idea of something called emotional intelligence. It was introduced by two theorists named Salvoy and Mayer a number of years ago. Emotional intelligence looks at our ability to kind of recognize not only our own emotions, but the emotions of others and the emotional connotations of specific situations. People who are said to have high emotional intelligence tend to be in tap with their emotions and can understand the kind of way that emotions are impacted, and in doing so, usually navigate social situations a little bit better than their peers that are maybe lower in emotional intelligence. And this idea of emotional intelligence is not necessarily brand new, but it has added a new wrinkle to our broad definition of intelligence already. To add even more wrinkles into it, a lot of researchers have begun to argue that when we look at the tests of intelligence that are out there, what they're really looking at, or at least trying to calculate out, is our what we call fluid intelligence, our ability to adapt and learn from things that we're encountering. We could say sort of like our cognitive flexibility. And this is usually linked up with the textbook definition of intelligence as well. But if we look closer at a lot of the tests and talk about how some of them might be biased or might be looking at intelligence in different ways, What we're really discussing is the fact that sometimes there's another type of intelligence that we value called crystallized intelligence. Intelligence of specific facts and information that we've accumulated throughout our lifetime. Testing for levels of crystallized intelligence can be very challenging because then you have to take into account cultural norms and individualized information that people are exposed to. Because you might necessarily think in your own world that knowing a lot about what you know is a great indication that you're becoming more and more intelligent, but somebody else's repertoire or collection of information that they acquire might be indications of their growth in intelligence, even if it's completely different from what you've acquired. And trying to pin down crystallized intelligence can sometimes be difficult, but when we want to understand how people can adapt to things and learn from their world, crystallized intelligence is kind of equally important to fluid intelligence. And when we talk about development, much like when we talk about all of these things, we look at how these things ebb and flow throughout our lifespan. So where does this lead us to exactly now that we've talked about all the different types of intelligence that are out there? Well, as I mentioned in the last slide, talking about ebbs and flows and growths and declines in these particular elements of intelligence is one thing that we can definitely discuss. Another thing that we can discuss that's related to it is kind of extreme cases in all these types of intelligence, both on the lower end and the upper end. It's tough to tackle all of the extreme cases and these different elements in the lower end and the upper end, but we'll try to tackle some of them and discuss how this gives us more information about the topic that we've looked at before, and we'll definitely be looking at again. That's the idea of heritability. Usually when we talk about the extreme and the lower ends, we usually focus on kind of the societal things that have impacted lower performance on different aspects of intelligence. But we will spend some time revisiting that debate on heritability and talk about, if we are looking at heritability, what that actually means for intelligence research. Let's get started by really dissecting some of the findings that have linked up developmental psychology with intelligence research over the years. As we've mentioned, numerous studies in the past have tried to link up the concept of heritability or genetic kind of overlap with intelligence. And it's probably important to note that numerous studies have shown, when we look at siblings and children and their parents, that intelligence performance on tests is extremely heritable. In fact, when we talk about the heritability of something, we often nowadays talk about something called the heritability coefficient, the percentage of overlap between a child and their parents that gives us an essence of how heritable or how much linked to genetics, or sometimes what we call nature, a specific characteristic is. If we're just going off of raw intelligence test scores, what we do see is that performance on those tests tend to be extremely high. In fact, it's one of the most heritable things that psychologists have been able to measure, again, if we're focusing on usually overall intelligence scores. Now, there are some nuances to this, though, that are worth mentioning. If we break down the individual scores on tests, we do see a lot more variability. And when we start to look at heritability in performance at really young ages, we don't see as much heritability there, which sort of leads to the question of what's causing these overlaps. And by the time we get into adulthood, we tend to see that the heritability levels have come out. And this is true not only for siblings raised together, but also siblings raised in different families and offspring of parents who never even met, which kind of suggests that yes, genes do seem to matter, and when there's a leveling out of intelligence scores, we seem to see that impact of genetics even more profoundly. But it also maybe highlights the fact that there could be some other underlying factors at play, like stereotypes and different biases that could lead people to get treated different ways that eventually cause performances on intelligence tests to emerge that maybe have less to do with a genetic proclivity for an intelligence performance and more to do with the way people are treated that eventually lead them to perform a specific way on an intelligence test. It's a complicated discussion, though, with lots of ifs and buts and back and forths that essentially I want you to take from this understanding that there is a high degree of heritability when it comes to performance on these intelligence tests, but there's lots of things that could be the source of it, and there's lots of things that can shift our performance on these tests, even if this is a very heritable thing. Talk about some of those social factors, those nurture factors, a little bit later. We want to understand, though, one of the things that's often linked to biological predisposition. We usually have to go outside of small, subtle changes in individual performances and instead turn our attention to the extremes. One of the areas that's picked a lot of individuals' interest over the years when we're talking about intelligence and heritability is extremes on the upper end, with what we call giftedness. Now, it's tough to sometimes pinpoint exactly what giftedness means, but if we need to use just a basic rule of thumb for what defines somebody as gifted, what we usually do is utilize the standardized tests like the Wechsler scales or the Stanford Binet tests, administer them to individuals, and focus on a person's overall IQ performance. And based on that, usually the cutoff for somebody being gifted is scoring above an IQ score of 130. Now, if we're talking about standardized tests, that means that we're looking at individuals who score in typically the 99th percentile on intelligence tests. Essentially, it means they're performing better than 99 out of 100 individuals taking these tests. Now, obviously, there's even more extremes than that, but if you make that cutoff, you get defined as gifted. And when we look at this group of individuals, what we do see is that there tends to be some genetic proclivities for giftedness. It's occasionally a situation where somebody who's gifted will come out of really nowhere without any genetic indicators that would suggest that they're going to perform that way on those tests. But what we also see is that there's lots of misnomers out there that don't necessarily align with what we see in giftedness research. We do see that giftedness tends to not only be something that's kind of inherent, but it's also something that needs to be nurtured. There's a lot of research that suggests that most people who perform really well on those tests also come from more affluent groups and groups that really push performance on cognitive tasks that usually reflect in higher scores on these intelligence tests. What we also see is that that pushing doesn't usually just impact one level of intelligence like we tend to think, but instead it tends to push an overall level of intelligence on these tests that usually manifests itself across all the different subcategories on these intelligence tests. There are some exceptions to this. There's a specific disorder called savant syndrome, where people actually perform well below average on most aspects of intelligence tests, but have a specific element within these intelligence tests that they perform really well in. And this really highlights the compartmentalized need for different types of intelligence that Howard Gardner talked about. But as an aggregate, when we talk about people that are performing above average on IQ tests that get them into that gifted category, we do typically see that people usually perform really well across all the different facets of intelligence testing. And if we're looking for how you could maybe coax this out of an individual, again, most research has suggested that genetic proclivities do matter, but the most important thing that's there is creating an environment that really pushes these cognitive skills. There's actually a number of case studies that I believe are still being mentioned in your book that highlight how parental interventions and the right type of scaffolding slash training linked to Lev Vygotsky can really enrich a child's understanding of things and enhance their chances of getting past that giftedness threshold. There's also a number of studies that have shown that genetic proclivities are definitely not usually sufficient. People who are put into environments that are extremely impoverished, which typically means for cognitive research, not stimulating mentally, tend to, regardless of what their genetic proclivity is, show struggles on these intelligence tests as they get into their adulthood years. And again, it gives us a sense that with intelligence and heritability and biology, even though there's a link between those two, the story's complicated, even in these extremes. On the other end of the intelligence spectrum, what we see is that the story is kind of equally complicated, even though there do seem to be a little bit easier to define lines associated with it. When we talk about people that are performing below average in intelligence tests, we don't usually talk about this term called intellectual disability until we're looking at really extremely low scores. Just like there was a cutoff for what we called giftedness, there's also a cutoff for what we call intellectual disabilities. Intellectual disabilities are usually identified when people don't just perform below average, but get a score of around 70 or below on those traditional intelligence tests. Usually with intellectual disability, this is not something that just randomly pops up over time. This is something that typically is persistent in childhood and is usually identified or flagged before many of these children are adults and given some different types of intelligence tests. If we're looking for that traditional cutoff to be defined as intellectually disabled, usually we're looking at people that have an IQ score below 70 on either the Wechsler scales or the Stanford-Binet tests, and also, in addition to those low performances, tend to struggle with different aspects of everyday life. But when we get into intellectual disability, it's more complex than just this basic cutoff and looking for what's going on. And the nuanced relationship between heritability and environment and these lower extremes of intelligence, we have to understand that intellectual disability is usually compartmentalized into 4 different groups. The first grouping of intellectual disability that's much, much more prominent than the rest, actually about 85% of people who are defined as having intellectual disability kind of fit into this category, are individuals that score somewhere between 50 and 69 on these intelligence tests. These are extremely low scores still. You're talking about 85% of 1% of the population. So you're looking at kind of a very few people, but out of the very few people, the vast majority of people fall into this range. And for these individuals that get scores between 50 and 69, what we see is that these individuals are struggling with aspects of their life and definitely are having some type of mental impairment that's noticeable. But typically for these individuals, their impairment is so that they can usually function with just maybe a couple people checking in on them on a day-to-day basis. And for these individuals, we tend to link up their impairments, their intellectual disabilities, with more environmental factors. Once we go below that cutoff, once we get down to around intelligence test performances that get in the ranges of 49 and below, what we start transitioning to is more of a discussion of biological issues. Typically, we see genetic or chromosomal factors really playing a major role here. It's not often that these things are necessarily inherited as much as they are a kind of byproduct of some type of developmental issue. Once you get below a level of 50 in the IQ test, you usually talk about what's called moderate intellectual disabilities. And this is, again, a decent percentage of the groups of individuals that qualify as having intellectual disabilities. For these individuals, unfortunately, they tend to need some type of regular care because they're not capable of usually taking care of themselves on a day-to-day basis. It's not necessarily to the point where they need assistance with every aspect of their life, but their mental functioning is severely limited as a result of some particular combination of things that make their intellectual disabilities really hinder their daily performance. For people that fall into the even lower categories, which we call severe and profound intellectual disability, what we see here is that there's usually some structural, really anatomical reason for their inability to function. And for these individuals, day-to-day functioning is not possible. And even when you get to the profound level, the ability to just do basic things like consuming food or moving is something that's very challenging. Usually when we start talking about those extremes, we go completely away from environmental factors that are linked up with these types of intellectual disabilities. And it highlights how we're talking about ranges and cognitive abilities. The debate over whether or not this is environmental or heritable is very nuanced. Extreme cases that are on the extremely lower ends and to almost always be linked not to the right combination of genes, but chromosomal, genetic abnormalities that are extreme and have a huge impact on almost every aspect of these individuals' lives. But when we creep up on the intellectual disability scale and get closer to the mild intellectual disability, we tend to see that, well, environmental factors and other things that maybe are at play could be really the precursors to developing these types of intellectual struggles. And again, it makes this story of intelligence really tough to kind of give a clear answer on and what the source of intellectual differences are. Another really interesting set of studies that's looked at this concept of heritability and intelligence have been ones that have looked at what happens in environments where essentially people don't get the stimulation they need. Numerous studies have shown that people who are coming from impoverished environments, not in terms of finances, but lack of kind of mental stimulation, tend to perform really low on these intelligence tests. Now, some have argued that this is an indicator of kind of a lessened cognitive skill set as a result of not getting the stimulation that you need. Others have argued that this is a prime example of intelligence tests being inherently biased. Essentially, their argument is that these individuals aren't getting zero cognitive stimulation and they're not developing zero cognitive skills that help them survive. It's just the skills that they're developing aren't really reflective of what you see in the questions embedded within these intelligence tests. It's a tough hurdle to tackle. There's no clear answer as to what's really causing these dramatic shifts in performance on intelligence tests when people find themselves in environments where they're not getting the right stimulation. But if we look at schooling lapses, if we look at health issues, if we look at environments that are challenging and kind of scary for individuals, we do see drops in performance across these intelligence tests. And we also see that interventions where kids who are flagged for being in situations where they might not get the stimulation they need can have a dramatic impact on performance in these tests. And that can often carry over to increased performances in things we link to intelligence, like school performances and problem solving skills and other things that typically are linked to higher levels of intelligence. We also see that more stimulation and more interactions and better health has been linked to another really interesting effect that we discovered in the 1990s called the Flynn effect. It's not necessarily that we discovered it, it's just that we kind of gave a name to something that had been occurring over and over again since intelligence tests were devised in the 1900s. If we look at the intelligence tests that were administered in the 1900s, a really simplistic comparison to what we administer nowadays. And in fact, if, say, somebody in 1990 took a test from 1930, what we'd find is that an average performance in 1990 would be considered an amazingly high performance in the 1930s. In fact, if you were just slightly above average in 1990, you would be considered gifted in the 1930s. And all this can be linked up to maybe better schooling systems, but also better health systems, and just kind of an enhanced attention to what it means to be cognitively on top and kind of extra training for kids at those ages. Essentially, anybody who's considered below average now would be considered usually average or above average back in the 1930s. But what makes this all the more interesting if we want to expand this Flynn effect is that over the past 2 decades or so, this Flynn effect has essentially stopped. And this really speaks to some interesting other facts. Some have argued that this reversing of the Flynn effect might be a byproduct of, say, cell phones or our current society that isn't pushing kids as much. Others have argued that maybe this not only stopping of the Flynn effect, but slight downturn of it might indicate changes to our health system, which, as we talked about in the very beginning of our intelligence test, has been, since the G factor was introduced by Charles Spearman, kind of linked to health, and especially early childhood health. It's probably like everything else we've talked about with intelligence research, a nuanced story. But this Flynn effect and numerous studies on interventions with intelligence show us that across a wide range of different types of intelligence, like emotional intelligence, like all of Gardner's intelligence theories, or theories, but aspects of intelligence, that the right types of training and genetic predispositions are probably both critical to understand where somebody is and their performance on the multitude of different intelligence tests that are out there. And on one of the topics we've been talking about, the inherent biases of tests, we actually tie this to a very current debate that's happening not necessarily among psychologists, but many social commentators. There has been a huge upswell in recent years examining classical tests like the Stanford Benet's, but also some of our more achievement-based tests like the SATs and ACTs, and explored whether or not there is an inherent bias within these that disadvantages specific groups within the population. Usually, these disadvantages are tied to racial groups or gender groups or kind of special subsets of the population that have, unfortunately, over the years, had a multitude of different disadvantages kind of thrown their way. But why I'm saying this isn't necessarily new to the psychological community is if you look back in the history of intelligence research, what you see is as early as the 1970s and 80s, researchers had already started looking at whether or not these tests that we used as kind of universal measures of intelligence were really getting at what truly was defined as intelligence across a multitude of different cultures. One of my favorite examples of kind of people opening their eyes to one of the kind of inherent flaws of these tests and just kind of giving them a chance to realize how biased we were when we were devising these was a collection of studies that looked at Aboriginal children in the 1980s and compared their performances on classic intelligence tests to kind of specially designed ones for individuals within their groups to get a better understanding of how maybe certain people within groups might not perform really well on our tests of intelligence, but for their culture and the things that they learn, might actually perform extremely well. I encourage you to watch actually the video link that I provided in this lecture. It's on the slides that you'll get, well, not the slides, but it's on the links that you'll get a little bit later. So you can see some of the first studies that started to discuss this need to redefine what we were using as our measure of intelligence and how we were comparing individuals across groups. It's kind of odd to note that this was a video that was created, I believe, in the late 1980s. The fact that we're still talking about this today kind of suggests that we're definitely not speeding through this particular debate anytime soon. But it really does highlight kind of how we have in the psychological community, and you'll find tons of publications on this if you're interested in it, tried to figure out how we could talk about changes and development while also taking into account the dramatic differences across cultures as to what's valued in terms of intelligence and what's the most appropriate way to compare cognitive abilities from one person to another. If we do, though, want to try to find some kind of common ground and understand a basic baseline of intelligence. We can try to remove some of the individual differences that might be attributed to things and some of the kind of cultural norms that have popped up over the years, and still try to understand how performance in general cognitively changes with our age. And what we see when we do try to control for lots of outstanding factors is that intelligence test performance for each individual tends to be pretty unstable at a young age. In fact, infants, when we try to measure their cognitive capabilities, can jump all over the board in their performance within a span of a few weeks. But once we get into early childhood, our intelligence levels start to not necessarily stagnate, but start to regulate themselves and kind of fluctuate, but much less than they used to. And they tend to hover around a specific level on whichever aspect of intelligence we're measuring. There is still some shifting that tends to go on, so these hoverings can not necessarily be flat as much as they can be kind of in a linear direction and a path. And by the time we reach late childhood, early adolescence, what we tend to see is that whatever you're doing in terms of intelligence tests at that age tends to be pretty predictive of how you'll behave in early adulthood and middle adulthood and late adulthood. There's a big caveat to this, and that's the fact that if interventions or tragic experiences happen, these trends can be obliterated. Right? If you encounter some very undesirable things in your life, you can see a huge drop in your intelligence test performance from late childhood into your early to middle adulthood. If you do receive lots of extra training and you find yourself in an environment that really brings out specific aspects of intelligence, you can see a huge upswell in your performance on these measures, even if you weren't necessarily performing extremely well at a young age. So as an aggregate, essentially we see this large amount of movement as a young child that starts to narrow and really settle in a certain spot by the time we reach adolescence, allowing for the fact that there's going to be a lot of individual differences at hand as well. This is also something that we see for two types of intelligence that we talked about previously. And there's lots of individual differences that pop up, but overall there's some really predictable changes for the vast majority of the population. These two areas of intelligence that I'm referencing here are what's called fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. As we talked about before, fluid intelligence is kind of our aptitude or our ability to process new information. What we tend to see in most research is that no matter how high or low you are on fluid intelligence, your performance on fluid intelligence tests tend to peak at around early to mid adulthood. And after that, it tends to drop off just a tiny little bit. But until you get into usually middle adolescence, your fluid reasoning or fluid intelligence is not always that high. At least it's significantly lower than it will likely be by the time you reach adulthood. Again, just so we're clear, there's always the potential for individual differences to pop up, but as a whole, most of us do tend to peak in our fluid intelligence in that beginning to middle of early adulthood. Our crystallized intelligence, though, the total accumulated information that we have and our ability to kind of utilize that in specific situations, as we mentioned kind of earlier, continues to rise pretty much throughout our entire lifetime. In fact, when measuring the crystallized intelligence of individuals, what we tend to see is that until there's physical deterioration of the brain, where there's some type of thing that's preventing us from being able to really access information, until that happens, usually people's crystallized intelligence continues to rise or at least just stay at an even level throughout the entire lifespan. And this is something that's often tied to the concept that we referenced earlier called wisdom. And there's some other ideas that kind of pop up along the way. But it really shows us that when we start qualifying what intelligence is, we might get a very different story in terms of when we peak and what the best time to kind of measure intelligence is. This is also something that we can relate to specific skill sets that are a part of that information processing model that we discussed earlier. If we're looking at vocabulary skills, what we see is that for most people, even throughout their young adulthood into late adulthood, you see a small uptick in vocabulary skills. Of course, once we get into usually our 20s, mid 20s, our visual speed or perceptual speed starts to decrease. So we have to make tests essentially easier to compare people in their 50s and 60s if we're measuring how fast they can do specific tasks. We also see a slight downtick in our number competency. But again, much like lots of the other things that we've talked about, there are individual differences here. So people that continue using numbers well into their adulthood years can retain most of their number skills well into their late adulthood. But for the vast majority of the population that really don't ever pick up a calculator after they graduate from college, a lot of them tend to see a nice, steady, gradual decline in number competency that can be tied to different intelligence tests. And all of this gives us a very enriched story when it comes to changes that we should expect to see throughout our lifespan when it comes to intelligence test performance. We can talk about kind of general trends for people. We can talk about specific elements of intelligence that pop up and come down. And what it gives us is a more complex story than just talking about the nature versus nurture debate that many people for a long period of time focused on when linking developmental psychology to this area that we again time here as I look at the ticker clicking by. But there are two last topics that I want to cover because in my mind they kind of provide cherries on the top of this sundae of craziness that we have when it comes to intelligence and lifespan development. And the first cherry on top I like to cover is one that oftentimes is tied to kind of knowledge and age. It's this idea of something called wisdom, or you might hear it in some circles called pragmatic knowledge. We do, as I mentioned before, tend to see individuals increase their crystallized intelligence throughout their lifespan, which tends to be then intermixed with this idea that as we get older, and since we're knowing more, we tend to be wiser. We want to first, so we can understand where there's problems with this assumption, give a clear-cut definition of what psychologists define as wisdom. When we talk about wisdom, we're not necessarily just talking about being a better decision maker or having more knowledge. What we're really talking about is kind of a combination of the two, where you have a vast array of knowledge that allows you to make better decisions and act more appropriately across a wide range of areas. And when we define wisdom like that, what we see is that even though we do oftentimes have that uptick in crystallized intelligence throughout our life, most of us never quite get to that threshold of being what we would call wise. Most of us tend to, if we're looking at the decisions we make in our 50s and 60s and 70s and beyond, make about as crummy of decisions and make about as many as mistakes as we did when we were in our 20s and 30s. And this is something that tends to kind of surprise people. That there is this underlying assumption that everybody who gets older automatically becomes wiser, and is at least significantly wiser than they were when they were younger. But the data in intelligence research doesn't really support that notion. If we're looking for when people start to display what we would call wisdom, we tend to see is the very small percentage of the population that gets there tends to show an emergence of wise decision making and better actions, usually around the time of early to middle adulthood. And if we're looking for what triggers this, what we tend to see is that it's kind of a combination of environmental factors and personality factors that can kind of lead to extra knowledge and easier decision making. Essentially, what we see is people who are wise tend to have a wide array of experiences by the time they reach early adulthood. They're exposed to multiple mindsets, they've challenged themselves in a multitude of different ways, and they also have personality factors that correlate well with this openness to thinking and better decision making. And in particular, they tend to be higher in things that we'll talk about later called openness to experience. And they also tend to be a little bit higher in something called extroversion. For some reason, being more willing to consider more stuff and being more willing to be exposed to others tends to lead in conjunction with maybe an inherent bias that not inherent bias, sorry, I don't know why I said that, an inherent heritability and maybe some experiences that all come together and coalesce into leading to wisdom. There's lots of debate as to kind of what the key element is to trigger wisdom in people. There's lots of debate over what the threshold is before we start calling somebody wise. But I always like to cover that because I always know that there's a lot of individuals that when they watch these videos are waiting to hear about how our intelligence is extremely high when we get older. And we study that. It's just the research doesn't always confirm this particular assumption. Cherry on the top that I always like to kind of provide at the end of this intelligence lecture is the fact that some of our current research that we've run over the years has started to bring into question a lot of the cognitive decline assumptions that we had talked about in previous classes. If you remember back to that Flynn effect that we talked about a few slides ago, I mentioned the fact that previous generations tended to score lower on intelligence tests, and this was kind of a trend that had occurred for almost an entire century. Well, this particular effect, once we started to look at it closer, opened the eyes of many people studying aging to realize that if we were running these classic, what we call cross-sectional designs, where we were comparing 70-year-olds to 60-year-olds to 40-year-olds to 30-year-olds, might give us kind of an overestimate of how much we mentally decline as we get into the latter years of life. As researchers started to kind of try to control for this Flynn effect, they were pushed to run longitudinal studies or that kind of combination hybrid of cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. And they started to find when they did this that the drop-off in intelligence test performance and a lot of cognitive skills was not nearly as robust as we had originally thought. And as a result of this, we've now started to kind of hedge on what causes the cognitive declines that we assumed were just inherent as we get older. This is why, if you've been listening, you might have noticed I've almost always, when talking about cognitive declines, said, look, it happens, but if you're doing this or doing that, the decline could potentially be much less. That's because we keep finding that there's all these external factors that really do have an impact on the trajectory, the path that our mental functioning undergoes as we get into early adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood. So hopefully you can appreciate when people start talking about these things again, that not only should age be tied to some of these things, but different cultures, different generations, and different elements of kind of the test that we're giving should also be considered when we talk about the changes people undergo in their mental functioning throughout a wide range of different things. I'm going to mark the end of this lecture. Sorry, I know it went a little bit longer than I've been aiming for with these, but we got through everything and hopefully we're able to kind of hedge and cover the things that we needed to cover in a sensitive way, the way I was hoping to. And if we've successfully done that, it's time now to move on to language, our very last cognitive psychology topic that we're going to be covering in this class. So make sure that you've gone through this again, done all the readings, and when you're ready, we'll see you all in our next lecture when we talk about language and how that also relates to developmental psychology. Until then, take care.